I always like to think of it as the trade union movement's answer to the TaxPayers Alliance, but with less money and more brains. As you say, this is the 20th anniversary since Unions21 came into being, and let's just think back to what Britain was like back then in 1993. The Tories were in power and deeply unpopular. The economy was struggling to recover from a deep recession, and a food safety scandal meant nobody was eating beef. How times change. Now, I think you've produced a first-class piece of work in that Fair Commission report, and I want that report to help shape thinking across the trade union movement, not just within the Labour Party, not just across the political spectrum, but out there where it counts with ordinary working people and voters. Because as well as highlighting the scale of low pay, low productivity, low security work that characterises too much of our labour market, the Commission has come up with some really good proposals about how we build a fairer, more secure, more family-friendly workplaces where workers have a stronger voice. In other words, for me, this is about how we humanise work, how we democratise work. I also want to thank John for joining us today and for his forward-looking work as the Labour Party's policy review coordinator, and for what I think was a thoughtful and interesting speech. I certainly welcome Labour's focus on good work, and also on that notion of pre-distribution. We may not always use the same language, but it's about tackling the root causes of inequality and shaping a social market. I think it represents a much needed shift in thinking, so that instead of the taxpayers subsidising employers who pay low wages through the tax credit system, we have a labour market that delivers not just decent wages, but a fair share of the wealth that we all produce. The challenge, of course, is translating all of that into an imaginative policy agenda that's both practical and popular. So I want to issue a challenge to Labour to put better work at the heart of your programme to win back power in 2015. Because I think it's time to respond to that huge frustration that ordinary people out there feel, who work hard for little reward, who feel that work is a fundamentally unfair experience, and who are seeing their living standards in free fall as their bosses get richer. So better work, decent pay, and a fairer share of power is central to building that model of capitalism that Ed Miliband identified back in 2011 as one of his defining priorities. And we need some bold thinking from Labour about the world of work and the crucial role that unions can play in making our workplaces better for all. Now, the theme of this conference is stronger unions turning the tide, and I've absolutely no doubt in my mind that we need a strong, effective trade union movement in order to build a fairer labour market, a stronger economy, and a more equal society. And for the TUC, I think there are three key challenges that we see over the next decade. First, we need fair wages. Sounds obvious, and it is. But winning a more even distribution of rewards within our economy is perhaps the biggest challenge facing all of us on the left. Unions21 polling highlights the strength of public support for measures to increase pay for the majority and curb excessive reward at the top. And I think a lot of those findings make for fascinating reading. Nearly 9 in 10 people believe the minimum wage isn't high enough to meet living costs. 3/4 say they would be more likely to buy goods or services from a living wage employer. 7 in 10 support a cap on bonuses, something George Osborne maybe should have taken note of before he headed off on that Eurostar to Brussels to defend the city's unique interpretation of performance-related pay. And nearly half of people believe that centrally set pay rates for different sectors would be fairer. So there's clearly a strong appetite for change. I think we're all familiar with the statistics showing just how grotesquely unequal Britain has become. Just last month, the Resolution Foundation published research showing that the top 1% now grab 10% of all income, while the entire bottom half account for just 18%. People on low and medium incomes have seen their wages stagnate and levels of household debt spiral. That's why we need action to boost wages for ordinary working people. And the minimum wage must be made just that, with proper enforcement for sure and real punishment for those who break its rules. And I welcome Labour's new commitment to get tough. But we've also got to get back to expecting the minimum wage to rise above both wage and price inflation each year. And we should use the power of procurement to spread the living wage in those who expect to do business with or receive aid from the public sector. But I think we need to be honest about this, because even if every Labour council used every pound in its budget to push it in the private sector, only a fraction of those 5 million people who currently labour for less than the living wage would be helped. And as a former member of the Low Pay Commission, I think there is a big gap. Now, it's never easy, through my experience on the Low Pay Commission, in that tripartite approach, I can tell you it's never easy to set the same legal minimum for every industry. And one big issue is that it's obvious that there are many industries that could easily absorb a much higher minimum wage, but they get the same floor as those industries that are genuinely struggling. That's why I have to say it was so disappointing to see the landed gentry out in force in the House of Lords this week to abolish the agricultural wages bill, something that previous Conservative governments had backed away from. Instead, we should be looking not just at bringing back a wages floor in agriculture, but looking at renewed wages councils for other sectors too. Just like the minimum wage, they would involve employer, union, and expert voices. But rather than considering the whole economy, they could look at the precise profits, the precise circumstances of industries from food to construction, where we know the evidence is clear those industries could afford to pay more. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a tiny minority at the top, city bankers, hedge fund managers, captains of industry, who have seen their wealth rocket out of control. Even when the economy tanks, the one-armed bandit that is the city keeps on giving. As recent research from the High Pay Centre shows, executive pay has trebled over the last decade, with CEOs of top companies enjoying a 12% pay rise over the last year alone. They now earn, and I use that term loosely, an average of £4.8 million. That's 185 times the average wage. And that's one of the reasons why we urgently need worker representation on remuneration committees that set boardroom pay, something that commands overwhelming public support, with over 3/4 of people in your poll and in many other polls showing they're in favour, including, I might add, 7 in 10 Conservative voters. There's certainly real anger out there about what's going on in the bailed out banks, where stratospheric rewards remain the order of the day. The boss of RBS, for example, receives a basic salary of £1.2 million, and later this month will collect a £780,000 bonus. Rewards described by his chairman as, quote, well below the average in world banking, and, quote, modest. Now, you may have seen a letter from an ambulance medic that was published in a national newspaper a few weeks ago, and I want to read it to you because I think all decent-minded people in Britain will sympathise with what he said. So this is what he said. I am part of a two-man crew. We often get up at 4 a.m, then drive anything up to 2 hours to our area of cover, all in our own time. Then follows a 12-hour intensive shift where we deal with anything from multiple car pile-ups to seriously ill children. The stress is monstrous, but we are exempt from any legislation that makes sure we're not worked to death, as we are an emergency service. Our average wage is £15 an hour. We are lifesavers, counsellors, and sometimes just company, as we hold the hand of someone beyond help. We have cultivated a black sense of humour so we don't crumble, and even so often cry on the way home. I would like to say to Sir Philip Hampton of RBS that our wages are modest for what we do. A multi-million-pound pay packet for a banker's success or failure is not modest. We take home on a grueling year of real blood, sweat and tears what Stephen Hester earns in 6 days. I wish that those who earn such sums would realise their remuneration is not right. I think he speaks for us all. I don't know that there is much more that I can add to that, but it makes me even more determined to make progress on a second front, which is economic democracy. After 3 decades of free market ascendancy and business knows best ideology, I think it's an idea whose time has come. We urgently need checks and balances to the managerial prerogative, or in plain English, a much stronger voice for workers. People feel that the balance of power has swung far too far in favour of big business and the banks. And according to that Unions21 poll, they think the main cause of that power imbalance is the rise in part-time work over full-time work and the lack of job security due to high unemployment. Now, of course, that is symptomatic of a cheap labour economy that ranks as one of the most slightly regulated in the OECD, and a reflection of how trade unions have been systematically marginalised in this country, because the vast majority of private sector workers now have no way to have their voice heard, no say in the way that their company is run, and no means to hold their employer to account. They say, of course, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and corporate Britain is no exception to that rule. That denial of economic citizenship is one reason why there is runaway greed at the top, why such poor decisions have been made, and why workers feel so disempowered. And that has to change. It means a stronger framework of employment rights, both individual and collective, bringing the UK into line with the EU mainstream. It means new systems of corporate governance that empower all stakeholders, including staff and their unions, not just shareholders. And it means worker and union representation on company boards, as we've seen in successful German companies. Most fundamentally, economic democracy demands stronger unions and stronger collective bargaining too. Even the likes of the IMF, OECD and McKinsey, the shock troops of capitalism, now recognise the need to increase the bargaining power of lower middle-income workers, and strong unions are a huge part of that. So surely it's time for policymakers here in the UK to see unions not as some kind of special interest group to be placated, nor as an obstacle to our competitiveness, but as a force for economic and social justice. As history has shown, notably during the post-45 settlement, the best way to raise wages for ordinary workers, to improve their living standards, and to tackle inequality is through trade union organisation. And the third, following on from this priority, is that we need trade union renewal. In the long run, we won't deliver economic democracy or fair wages without it. Now, I recognise we need to take a long, hard look in the mirror ourselves and ask some pretty searching questions about why, when capital has so radically changed and restructured its own business models, trade union organisation has been unable to match that. And I'm also very conscious that there are huge opportunities that we could be seizing in terms of alliance building with other social movements, but also in our appeal to ordinary people. You talked, John, about the working group on loneliness being disbanded. I was listening to something on the radio this morning talking about how the likes of Facebook are actually selling relationships. I mean, it's what some people would call the commodification of relationships. I don't know what trade unions are about if we're not about relationships between people. And it seems to me if private companies like Facebook can see that opportunity, that maybe we ought to be thinking a bit more creatively about how we build our communities too. But I also don't want to end up in a kind of self-flagellation exercise, which I think can be a little too popular for my taste in parts of the trade union movement, because we also need to celebrate our strengths and not just focus on our weaknesses. I meet workers, as you do, every day of the week, who wouldn't have a job, wouldn't have their health, wouldn't have the chance to learn, wouldn't have the chance to spend time with their families if it wasn't for their union, and in particular, if it wasn't for their union rep. We speak up for ordinary people in a way that nobody else can. We've led national debates and won the argument, even if we've not always won the change that we want to see. We've been consistently right on the economy, and we were one of the few voices warning that austerity, and indeed public sector pay controls, would be self-defeating. And let's remember, it was us in the trade union movement who first made the case for an active industrial strategy, who said workers should be auto-enrolled into workplace pensions, who exposed the falling share of our national output going to wages, who highlighted the scandal of tax avoidance by UK PLC and the billions lost to our public services, and who worked alongside other campaigners to campaign for a Robin Hood tax. Now, working people need strong, effective, dynamic unions, but the reality is that now we have fewer than 6 million members of TUC-affiliated unions. The financial crisis, recession, huge job cuts in the public sector have all taken their toll. But today, around 1 in 7 private sector workers are now in a union. And before long, if things don't change, it could be 1 in 10. Of course, we could and must do much more to organise, especially in the private sector. But let's not kid ourselves that this is just some peculiarly British problem. This is a pattern of union decline that's been repeated around the world in nearly all countries where governments either championed or caved into the dominant neoliberal model. Conversely, where governments uphold values of economic justice and social solidarity, where they actively support strong trade unionism, for example, by enshrining industry-wide collective bargaining arrangements and by giving a role in unions a role in social insurance, unions are still strong. So if a progressive political party wants to break that neoliberal mold, if it holds faith with collective values, then it has to recognise that stronger unions are an essential part of the answer to one nation's problems. At stake is our shared ambition to make a real difference to the living standards and the lives of working people, our common goal of social and economic justice, and the long-term future of both wings of the movement. Thank you very much indeed.